Night settled over the Belgian forest like a closing fist. The pines swayed in a cold October wind, their branches whispering above the foxholes carved into the damp earth. In those trenches, German veterans, men who had survived Russia's winters and North Africa's heat, waited with a confidence born of long, brutal experience. They had fought Americans before, soft boys, loud boys, green boys, farmhands and factory kids who broke quickly once the artillery started walking toward them. Tonight would be no different, or so they thought, because somewhere beyond the tree line, a new American division was moving into position, fresh from the States, untested, supposedly harmless. But as the Germans cleaned their rifles and muttered about how easy the night would be, a rumor slipped through the ranks like a draft of cold air. Their commander, he's back. A name passed from trench to trench, a name spoken quietly, with a hint of unease. Terrible Terry. Some of the younger soldiers frowned. They had never heard it before, but the older ones, they remembered North Africa, Sicily. A general who refused to retreat, who attacked at night, who fought with a ferocity that defied doctrine. They did not know the details. They did not know the story, but they felt it. Something was different tonight, and in the darkness of the Ardennes line, one question began to take root. Who was this American general, and why did hardened German veterans fear him more than any other? The German soldiers didn't know it yet, but the Americans moving through the trees were not led by some fresh-faced officer from the States. Their commander was a man who had already carved his name into 2 continents, first in North Africa, then in Sicily. The division was new. He was not. Most American generals followed the textbook. They fought by daylight, advanced cautiously, and kept their headquarters far from danger. Terry Allen was nothing like them. He had a reputation for leading from the front, shouting orders with mud on his boots and blood on his uniform. He trusted action more than theory, instinct more than doctrine. But the strangest part of his story was the fall. Just a year earlier, at the height of his success, Allen had been relieved of command, fired, sent home. Officially, it was for lapses in discipline. Unofficially, some whispered he was too aggressive, too unorthodox, too willing to break rules that others clung to. Most officers never recovered from disgrace like that. Allen did the opposite. He returned to the war with a new division at his back, young men who would absorb his methods, his fury, and his refusal to retreat. He trained them harder than anyone thought reasonable, pushed them farther than doctrine allowed, and in doing so, he shaped them into something the Germans had never faced before. Now, that man, and the soldiers forged in his image, were creeping through the Belgian forest. The veterans in those foxholes had no idea that the next hours would be shaped not by the division they expected, but by the past of the commander they had hoped never to meet again. Long before Terry Allen's name echoed across North Africa and Europe, his life had already been shaped by the weight of uniforms and old battles. He was born on an army post in the Utah Territory, the son of Colonel Samuel Allen, a career officer whose entire world revolved around drills, duty, and distant horizons. Even deeper in the family line stood a Civil War veteran, Captain Carlos Alvarez de la Mesa, wounded at Gettysburg, a man who bled for the Union beneath the smoke of the peach orchard. For Terry, the Army wasn't a career option. It was inheritance. It was destiny. He grew up on frontier posts where childhood meant riding horses before you could read, learning to fire a rifle before you knew long division. He absorbed discipline not as rules on a wall, but as a rhythm of life. Salute correctly, saddle quickly, never show fear. Everyone expected him to continue the legacy. So did he. When he earned an appointment to West Point in 1907, the path seemed set. The family history would continue, another Allen officer forged by the Academy's iron discipline. But Terry Allen was not built for West Point. He chafed at the endless mathematics, the rigid rituals, the suffocating order. He earned demerits faster than he earned respect. He failed classes, he stuttered under pressure, and after years of struggle, the Academy expelled him in disgrace. For the Allen family, it was unthinkable. For Terry, it was humiliating. But history is full of paradoxes, and the greatest soldiers are rarely forged in straight lines. And so the question hung in the air, unanswered. How does a failed cadet, dismissed, embarrassed, written off, become the nightmare of hardened German veterans? Terry Allen should have disappeared after West Point. Most men did. A dismissal from the academy was a mark that followed you for life, an invisible weight that closed every door the Army had to offer. But Allen wasn't built to quit. He spent a year rebuilding himself from the ground up, studying at Catholic University, forcing discipline where none came naturally. And on November 30th, 1912, he did the unthinkable. Without West Point, without pedigree, without the Academy's blessing, he earned his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Cavalry. He had forced the Army to let him in through a side door. It would not be the last time he broke tradition. Allen's early career took him to the Mexican border, a land of dust, tension, and sudden violence. There, he began to reveal the traits that would define him. When a group of Mexican cattle rustlers crossed into American territory, doctrine said to hold position and wait for reinforcements. Allen chose differently. With only 6 men, he rode straight at 30 armed intruders. No hesitation, no elaborate plan, just aggression and audacity. When the fight was over, the rustlers were dead or captured, and the Army realized this young officer did not see the world the way others did. He moved fast. He trusted instinct. He acted before caution could slow him. And behind those decisions lay something deeper, a defiance of the rigid Army culture that had rejected him. If the rulebook stood in his way, he ignored it. If doctrine told him to wait, he advanced. If others hesitated, Allen attacked. In the quiet years before the next Great War, the Army was still searching for careful officers who followed every page of the manual. Terry Allen was becoming something else entirely. When the United States entered the Great War, Terry Allen feared he would miss it. He wanted a combat command, a chance to prove he belonged among real fighting men. Instead, the Army sent him to France with the 315th Ammunition Train, hauling shells to the front lines while others made history. But war has a way of opening doors for men determined to fight. Eventually, Allen received the command he had waited for, the 3rd Battalion, 358th Infantry Regiment of the 90th Division. The Western Front swallowed them whole. Mud, wire, bodies, and the endless howl of artillery. It was the crucible that revealed who Allen truly was. Most commanders avoided night operations. Too chaotic, too dangerous, too easy to lose control. Allen saw something different. He noticed how German machine guns tore daylight attacks to pieces. He saw how artillery observers could direct perfect killing fire when the sun was up. And he saw something else, how darkness leveled the battlefield. Under cover of night, defenders could not see targets. Artillery fired blindly. Machine gunners stitched shadows. Fear, not bullets, did most of the work. Allen realized night attacks saved lives. He began crafting a doctrine of brutal simplicity. Scout by daylight, brief every man until he knew the plan by heart, advance silently until discovered, then strike fast, strike hard, and keep moving. No complicated maneuvers, no elegant theory, just violence, surprise, and relentless momentum. On October 24, 1918, during an assault through wire and shattered trenches, a burst of German fire struck Allen in the face. Blood poured down his uniform. Medics tried to pull him back. He refused. He stayed with his men. Word spread down the line. The colonel is still here. Something changed in that moment. His soldiers no longer followed him because he outranked them. They followed him because he bled beside them. By war's end, Allen carried a silver star and 2 Purple Hearts. But he also carried something far more important, the certainty that darkness itself could be a weapon. And that conviction, born in the mud of France, would one day make him the most feared American commander on the German front. When the guns fell silent in 1918, Terry Allen expected the next war to come soon. He had tasted combat, understood its rhythm, and believed the world wasn't finished with violence. But the army he returned to was shrinking fast. 4 million soldiers became a force barely large enough to police its own bases. Budgets were slashed, divisions dissolved, promotions froze for years at a time. Officers who had commanded battalions went back to sitting behind desks as captains, sometimes for a decade. For many, it was a slow suffocation. For Allen, it was a test. He spent the interwar years doing what others wouldn't, preparing. He studied German tactics, the failures of the Great War, the early theories of armored warfare. He examined battles, diagrams, training manuals, anything that offered a clue about how the next war would be fought. Most officers treated these decades as a long, dull waiting room. Allen treated them as a forge. Whenever he had men under him, he pushed them harder than regulations required. Field exercises became grueling rehearsals, marches went longer, drills went later. His peers rolled their eyes, his subordinates cursed under their breath. But Allen knew something they didn't. Armies that stayed comfortable died in the first weeks of a real war. While others coasted toward retirement, he sharpened his instincts, his knowledge, and his will. And when the world finally lurched back toward conflict, Terry Allen was one of the few American officers truly ready for the fire to return. When Europe fell into flames again, the U.S. Army searched desperately for officers who could lead men in real combat. General George C. Marshall, quiet, brilliant, and always watching, saw something in Terry Allen that others had missed. He looked past the rough edges, the failed academy years, the unconventional habits, and saw a fighter. In one of the most dramatic promotions in modern Army history, Marshall leapfrogged Allen straight from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping an entire rank. It was a sign. When the next war came, the United States would need men who knew how to win, not just how to salute. Allen was given command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, the oldest, proudest division in the American Army. Their first test came in North Africa. The Americans were green, untested, unsure. The Germans were veterans under Rommel, masters of desert warfare. At Kasserine Pass, American units shattered under the assault. Tanks broke through, lines collapsed, and chaos swept across the front. Allen did not break. He and General Paul Robinette organized a counterattack at Jebel el Hamra that stopped the bleeding. He placed guns, moved battalions, steadied faltering men, holding the line while others fell back. That stand prevented a complete catastrophe and kept the Allies in the fight. But his true moment came at El Guitar. German tanks punched through the forward positions, threatening to overrun Allen's headquarters itself. Staff officers urged him to pull back. Allen refused. "I will pull out like hell," he growled, "and I'll shoot the first man who does." He walked outside, standing in the open as the tanks approached, calm as stone. His men saw him, and they held. The German attack collapsed under American artillery and tank destroyer fire. For the first time in the war, U.S. forces had stopped veteran German armor head-on. It was a victory that echoed across the Army. Then came Sicily. On the beaches of Gala, Allen's men landed under fire from artillery, tanks, and aircraft. They held the beachhead against 4 separate armored thrusts, fighting at point-blank range as shells landed among the waves. From there, the Big Red One pushed inland toward the mountains. At Troina, a fortress town carved into stone, the Germans launched 24 counterattacks in 6 days. 24 times, Allen's men threw them back. When Troina finally fell, the road to Messina opened. Terry Allen was at his peak. Time magazine put him on the cover. The Army celebrated him as a rising star. His division loved him. And then, 2 days before the magazine hit newsstands, he was fired. General Omar Bradley relieved Allen of command. Officially, it was for discipline. Unofficially, whispers said he was too wild, too reckless, too different for the Army's long war ahead. The man who had just won the toughest battles of the campaign was sent home in silence. And so another question began to form, quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. How does a disgraced general come back from this and return more dangerous than before? In October 1943, Terry Allen returned to the war a changed man. He had tasted victory, suffered humiliation, and been written off by men who believed his best days were behind him. But the Army wasn't done with him, not yet. They gave him a new division, the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves. On paper, it was nothing special. In reality, it was a gamble. These weren't hardened desert fighters or veterans from Sicily. They were young men from Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, farm boys, lumber workers, machinists. Most had never left their home states before boarding a train for basic training. To the German High Command, soldiers like these were predictable, Inexperienced, brittle under pressure, easy to break. Alan saw something else. He walked among the ranks, studied their faces, their posture, the way they moved under pack and rifle. They were raw, yes, but raw material can be shaped into steel. What mattered wasn't what they were. It was what he believed they could become. He decided he would build a division unlike any the U.S. Army had ever fielded. Training began immediately, and it was brutal. Alan drove them harder than regulations allowed, pushing marches farther, drills longer, exercises deeper into the night. He demanded endurance, discipline, and a kind of controlled aggression that mirrored his own approach to war. At first, the Timberwolves complained. Then they adapted. Then they improved. And Alan watched it happen with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman shaping something powerful. He wasn't teaching them to fight like everyone else. He was preparing them to fight like him. And soon, the Germans waiting in those dark forests would learn exactly what that meant. As the Timberwolves settled into their new identity, Alan intensified their training until it pushed the limits of what an American division could endure. While other units performed the standard 10 or 12 hours of tactical instruction each week, Alan drove his men through 30 to 35 hours, every week, without fail. To some, it felt like punishment. To Alan, it was preparation. He had learned in France that darkness could be a weapon, and now he meant to turn his entire division into masters of the night. Every exercise revolved around it: movement in darkness, hand signals, compass navigation, silent approaches over rough ground, attacks launched without spoken commands. If a soldier stumbled, Alan made him do it again. If a platoon made noise, they repeated the route. If a company hesitated, he marched them deeper into the trees until hesitation turned into instinct. He trained them to feel the terrain through their boots, to count steps automatically, to know where their comrades were, even when they couldn't see a hand in front of their faces. He wanted them to vanish into the darkness and reappear only when it was too late for the enemy to respond. Other divisions mocked the Timberwolves. Some called Alan unstable. A few whispered that he was preparing his men for failure or madness, but Alan ignored them. He had seen what night fighting could do in 1918. He had seen how darkness paralyzed even the strongest defenders and erased the advantages of veteran troops. He wasn't training the 104th for the war they expected. He was training them for the war he knew was coming. And in the forests of Belgium, the Germans were about to discover the cost of underestimating an army that owned the night. On the night of October 23, 1944, the Timberwolves entered combat for the very first time. Rain clung to the branches above them, and a cold wind drifted through the Belgian forest as the division moved silently into position. For the Germans waiting in their trenches, this was supposed to be routine, another easy victory against untested American troops. They expected confusion, they expected hesitation, they expected fear. What they got instead was silence. Alan's night fighters approached like shadows slipping between the trees. Entire companies moved without a single shouted command, guided only by compass, memory, and the discipline forged in months of brutal training. German sentries never heard them coming. The first strikes were sudden and savage. A machine gun nest neutralized before it could fire. A trench overrun before a flare could rise. A command post hit so quickly that no alarm was sounded at all. By the time German officers understood what was happening, the attackers were already gone, vanishing into the woods and reappearing somewhere else moments later. Reinforcements rushed toward the last reported contact, only to find darkness and bodies cooling in the mud. German veterans began sending frantic reports up the chain. "They are everywhere. They attack from the shadows. These Americans fight like demons in the dark." The Timberwolves struck, disappeared, and struck again. Fast, precise, relentless. This was the moment Alan had trained them for, the moment when the night itself became their weapon, when inexperience no longer mattered, when the months of hardship hardened into instinct. And as dawn crept across the trees, one thing became clear. This was only the beginning. The lightning success of the Timberwolves' first night operations sent shockwaves through the German positions, but the real test came days later at the Mark River. The river lay black and cold under a moonless sky, its far bank bristling with German machine guns, tripwires, and overlapping fields of fire. A daylight assault would have been suicide. So Allen chose darkness. At midnight, the Timberwolves slipped into the water, rifles held overhead, boots tied together, ammunition wrapped in oilcloth. The Germans were certain the river was impassable without boats. That certainty proved fatal. When the first American soldiers emerged from the far bank, the Germans didn't fire. They didn't even move. They had no idea anyone was there. Within minutes, American squads were behind their lines, cutting wire, silencing sentries, seizing positions that should have taken hours of fighting. When German officers finally realized the crossing had begun, the Timberwolves were already everywhere, spreading like ink through the trenches, collapsing their defenses from the inside. The crossing shattered the German assumption that night meant safety, and Allen was only getting started. In the Aachen sector, the 104th pushed against fortified positions that had held off Allied attacks for weeks. Bunkers, pillboxes, anti-tank guns. The Germans believed they had sealed every approach. Allen broke those defenses the same way he broke everything else, at night. Under the cover of darkness, Timberwolf patrols infiltrated trenches, mapped firing lanes, and identified weak points. Then, the attacks began, swift, silent, coordinated strikes that bypassed strongpoints and crushed resistance before dawn. German commanders tried to adapt. They doubled their night patrols. They added flares, alarms, tripwires. It made no difference. The Timberwolves slipped through it all, night after night, strike after strike, and soon a warning spread among the German ranks, first as a murmur, then as a grim certainty. Beware the Timberwolves at night. When the Germans launched their massive Ardennes offensive in December 1944, chaos swallowed the front, units shattered, lines buckled, entire sectors fell back under the weight of German armor pushing toward the Meuse. But in the middle of that storm, one division refused to break. For 2 brutal months, through snow, freezing rain, and relentless artillery, the Timberwolves held their ground. They dug in along ridges and forest edges, absorbing the shock of every German thrust. While other units were forced to retreat, Allen's men stood fast, fighting through nights so cold, rifles froze to bare skin. They did not yield an inch, and when the Nazi offensive finally stalled, the 104th was still there, scarred, exhausted, but unbroken. Their resilience stunned even commanders who had doubted them. What began as a rumor was turning into a battlefield truth. The Timberwolves were among the toughest soldiers in the European theater. Then came February 23, 1945. Under Allen's direction, the division launched a nighttime crossing of the Roer River, another operation thought impossible under German observation and artillery. But darkness was their ally. By dawn, they had secured the far bank and punched deep into Germany itself. Town after town fell in rapid succession. Roadblocks collapsed. German units that had fought since 1939 were outmaneuvered in the dark. The whispers became certainty. The certainty became legend. The Timberwolves were no longer just a good division. They were elite, night specialists, the soldiers who owned the darkness, and every German commander on the Western Front knew it. By early March 1945, the Timberwolves were advancing faster than their maps could be updated. Their push carried them to the ancient city of Cologne, a city scarred by years of bombing, its cathedral rising defiantly above the ruins. As armored columns fought in the streets, Allen's infantry moved block by block, clearing buildings with the same precision they carried into their night attacks. By March 5th, Cologne fell. But the victory revealed something darker. Days later, as the 104th drove deeper into central Germany, Allen's men entered the outskirts of Nordhausen. There they found a place that froze even the hardest soldiers where they stood. Rows of bodies lay scattered across the grounds, thousands of them, some in bunks, some on the floors, some piled in corners like discarded objects. The men who had survived the Ardennes broke. Many turned away in shock, others vomited, a few knelt without saying a word. They had fought Germans in open battle and respected them as soldiers, but this was different. This was not war. This was murder. Allen walked through the camp slowly, taking in every detail. There was no enemy here to fight, no tactic to counter, no position to seize, only the ruins of human lives. And he made a decision. The people of Nordhausen would not claim ignorance. He ordered German civilians from the nearby town to be rounded up and marched into the camp. They protested. They shook their heads. Some cried. Allen didn't care. He made them walk past the corpses, made them see the consequences of the regime they had supported or tolerated. Then he ordered them to bury the dead with their own hands. In that moment, the war shifted for the Timberwolves. It was no longer just a campaign of rivers and roads, of bunkers and night attacks. It became a reckoning, and every man who walked out of Nordhausen carried something he would never be able to lay down again. By the spring of 1945, Allen's Timberwolves were moving faster than any division in their sector. They advanced 193 miles in just 9 days, through towns, forests, and crumbling German defenses, driving deeper into a collapsing Reich. On April 26th, near the Elbe River, they linked up with Soviet forces pushing from the east. The Third Reich was finished. And then something remarkable happened. General Omar Bradley, the man who had fired Terry Allen in Sicily, visited the Timberwolves. He looked at the division Allen had built, at the soldiers who now fought like seasoned veterans, and admitted what once seemed impossible. The 104th stood alongside the 1st and the 9th as one of the finest assault divisions in the entire European theater. For Allen, it was vindication without celebration. The war ended on May 8, 1945. His work was done. The warrior who refused defeat. Terry Allen retired a year later. He never became a 3-star general. Some said he was too rough, too direct, too willing to bend rules the army preferred to keep straight. But the men who served under him knew better. Then tragedy struck. His only son, Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen Jr., was killed in Vietnam in 1967 while leading the same battalion his father had commanded in World War I. The loss broke something inside the old general. 2 years later, Terry Allen died in El Paso and was buried beside his son. Today, the institution that once expelled him, West Point, honors his name with the General Terry Allen Award, given to the cadet with the highest achievement in military science. Allen won every major battle he fought. He built 2 elite divisions from the ground up, and he taught the Germans one immortal truth. When the sun went down, the night belonged to terrible Terry Allen. If you believe stories like this shouldn't be forgotten, help keep them alive.